Well, look at the stalwarts who've stayed. We're going to make change together. Thank you for staying, and we thought we'd talk a little bit about communication today. I am the chairman of the Connecticut Legislature's Energy and Technology Committee. But years before I did that, I was a journalist, and among the things I covered a great deal were energy issues, where we actually went and covered energy issues. We didn't just do it in a building and do talking heads. We went out and we really did, some in-depth reporting. And what I discovered as a journalist was, creating a narrative that really brought people into the process, to be able to tell them why it was important, to help them connect the dots, and to really make it much more accessible. So as a legislator, that's one of the things that I've really tried to do, is to get rid of the acronyms and to really connect, and not just to the general population, but to fellow legislators. You may have had this experience in your lives, beginning to discuss this area of interest, and then you suddenly notice people are picking up their cell phones and go, oh yeah, that's really interesting. And their eyes glaze over, because these are very dense and difficult subjects. And then when we start speaking in shorthand to one another, it's very distancing. And I had to take a bill out the other night, and Jonathan's still here. My colleague, State Representative Jonathan Steinberg, on the Energy Committee as well, at 3:30 in the morning. And to make sure your colleagues are on board, and energy legislation is always controversial. No matter how much work you've done, it's going to be controversial. So it's really important to galvanize your colleagues and get them on board, because these debates can get raucous and you can lose people. So I had done a lot of pre-planning and discussing and trying to tell legislators how it impacted their districts. Painting pictures, talking about rising seas on Long Island Sound. I think is scheduled to rise 20 inches by 2050, which, unless you're really engaged in the subject matter, it's like, so. So then you begin to explain to people who live in nearby shoreline towns, either on the shore or nearby, not directly on the water, but a little back. Have you noticed when you're driving on the state road coming through your community that frequently there's water on the road at high tide now, and you have to go around? And I'll go, oh yeah, I have noticed that sometimes, Oh, that's climate change? That's rising seas? You begin to kind of paint a picture, connect the dots, and tell them what they're seeing and what they're experiencing is happening because of these environmental impacts. You also, I have had constituents. I represent a shoreline town, and I've had constituents say, well, I don't live on the water. I live up on the hill, so why should I care? You say, well, let's look at the grand list. The folks who live on the water, yeah, they pay higher taxes, which support our schools and our town services, and when those houses are no longer sellable, because of the rising seas, if you don't care about the environmental impacts, think about the financial impacts. Suddenly, property taxes are going to go up and you're going to have to pay more. And they're like, oh, I never, So to begin to really tell the story and paint a picture, people may have heard that Connecticut has some budget issues. So we've had some really important funds swept, RGGI funds. We've had the energy efficiency funds for our energy efficiency companies, and we were about to do a press conference to really protest that. And I said to the energy efficiency people, I really don't want to see legislators standing up against the wall and talking about energy efficiency funds, because everybody's going to think it's caulking and insulation. You need to bring me the people who are running these companies and working for these companies. We need to connect these people to the legislators who represent their districts. And so they did, and they brought us just incredible people and incredible stories, and those are the stories we told. We had them come to the microphone and say, I was unemployed for 2 years. And then I got into this energy efficiency business because there was a company near me, and I was taught a trade. And I've been now working for 2 years in this trade, which I love, and you go into people's homes and you help them, and they're so grateful. And I've made a nice living, and my wife and I are about to buy a house and pay property taxes. You know, we're turning people into taxpayers. Now suddenly, the legislators are paying attention. You know, you're telling a story that's gripping them. I had one of our agency people say to me the other day that, and she was going to testify that, you know, she said the OCC is upset that the CES doesn't include a value for DER. And I said, oh God, do not come up and just, okay, the Office of Consumer Counsel, you know, the woman who protects consumers, you know, tell the story in real terms. Lay out a narrative that's compelling, because the minute you hear acronyms, even if you know them, you know, even if you're into the wonky, number one, you shut down. It's like, oh yeah, OCC, DER, blah, blah, blah. But anybody that you could bring on board, they're lost, and they're angry. I mean, that's the other thing that happens when you distance people. They get angry, and they feel you're trying to exclude them. So, you know, I'm not going to go on and on, but I think, you know, the more we try to paint a picture, the more we create a narrative. And there is no energy reporting anymore beyond, it always makes me laugh. When I first went to New York City, there was a reporter who was still working. He was quite senior at that point, named Jimmy Breslin. And he wrote The Gang Who Couldn't Shoot Straight, but he was a real reporter. He was out on the street, he was getting it done, and he used to say to the young ones, you youngins, he said, you know how you do a story? You get out of the effing building and get out on the street, go talk to the people, go see what's happening. And now, because, and it's not that we don't have good reporters, but they're not supported by their organizations anymore. You know, they're not given the resources that they need. They're not paid very much anymore. You know, they used to give me helicopters and things, you know, had to go cover a story, you know, however you needed to get there to go tell the story. So you really have to paint a picture for them now, because they really can't get out and see it for themselves, and they walk around in our situation in the Capitol. They walk around the Capitol, and they go to the public hearing, and they do a couple of talking heads, and then they do a stand-up open and close if it's a television thing, or they write it, and it's just so, it just doesn't galvanize you. It doesn't really tell the story. So the more we can, I found there are a couple of people that actually Jonathan and I work with who really do now in-depth storytelling, because we fill them in on what it really means. And, you know, I find that really, really helpful. So anyway, enough. I want to introduce now, I want to make sure I'm doing oh yes, I'm introducing Jerry Taylor. Jerry Taylor has had a transformational experience. He has realized environmental salvation, and he now heads the think tank, a very active think tank. Pronounce it for me again?
Niskanen.
The Niskanen think tank. And he's going to talk about how he turned around in the energy environmental policy arena. Jerry.
Well, thank you for that introduction. It's wonderful to be here. I don't have PowerPoint because there's still enough libertarian in me to believe that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely, so I'll pass on that. For the few minutes we have, I've been charged with talking about how to communicate climate information, how to communicate these issues with voters and people who maybe aren't in the legislatures like so many of you, which requires us to spend a moment investigating exactly where public opinion comes from. And it turns out that if you look at the political science literature, it's fairly, there's been much work done on this over many decades, and there is as close to an orthodoxy as one could imagine in any field of academic work on the question of where public opinion, to the extent to which it exists on climate change, comes from. And it comes from elite cues. In other words, people believe what they believe when it comes to climate change based on what their political champions tell them. Now, this is not just a story of Republicans, nor is it just a story of Democrats. It is a universal observation across policy arenas and across political parties and ideologies and opinions. And we know this as a general matter. John Zoller, a political scientist, in his book, Mass Opinion in Public Policy, nailed this point several decades ago, and it's been repeatedly tested and tested and tested again, and holds up rather nicely to investigation. It also holds up nicely in the climate change arena. A sociologist named Robert Brule from Drexel University has done a series of very aggressive regression analyses in which he's tried to figure out what explains the movement in public opinion on climate change. And it turns out public opinion on climate change does move around a bit. He found, however, that it's mostly Republican movement that explains these vacillations, not Democratic movement. Democratic opinion on climate change has held fairly steady over the last several decades, largely because the messages from Democratic political agents and left-of-center outlets that inform Democratic voters has been relatively stable on this topic. But it turns out what Republican messaging has been over the last 3 or 4 decades has indeed varied quite a bit. And so in testing what explains this change, is it extreme weather events? Is it how much the Kochs are spending? Is it media coverage? Is it upturns and downturns in the economy? When the economy is doing well, we might want to spend more on environmental protection than when it's doing poorly. And based on what Republican politicians are saying. And what he found is that nothing explains Republican opinion shifts on climate change better than does what Republican office holders and elected officials and organs on the right are saying about climate change. That explains it. And in fact, it wasn't always that denialism held this party by the throat, the party that I'm from. It turns out, you may not remember, it was only a decade ago, that John McCain won the nomination for the presidency of the United States as a Republican in 2008, calling for decarbonization and market-oriented responses to climate change in a rather aggressive fashion. And in fact, the 2008 Republican platform could have been written by Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, or Sheldon Whitehouse. It called for a fast march away from fossil fuels using market forces like cap and trade or carbon taxation to get us there. And if you look at Republican opinion back at that time, it was not overwhelmingly supportive of climate action, but it was far more supportive than it was today. Why? Because John McCain, and even back then Newt Gingrich, was doing commercials on Nancy Pelosi talking about the need to address climate change and climate risk. So if we want to move and better inform public opinion on climate change, we probably want to focus some of our attention on the Republican Party because that's where the heavy lift is. And if you're going to do that, you need to focus your efforts on Republican elites. To do otherwise is to swim against an extremely strong tide. So retail communication, going to Kiwanis clubs or what have you to talk to right-of-center voters or people who are relatively agnostic about climate change is a wonderful use of your time, but it's probably not going to lead to very much because against the gale force winds of what these voters are hearing from media outlets and their political champions, you will be lost. So the Niskanen Center focuses its attention on moving Republican elites. And we have a little bit of a competitive advantage in that business in Washington because for 23 years, before I started the Niskanen Center in 2014, I worked at the Cato Institute, which is a bastion of right-of-center thinking. It's a fairly orthodox, hardline libertarian policy organization in Washington, D.C., budget of $30 million or so. And I became a vice president over my years at the Cato Institute as one of the nation's foremost climate skeptics. I've spent a great deal of time in the pages of the Wall Street Journal, on Fox News and National Review, and coming to forums like this, arguing against climate action. If you Google me and climate skepticism, your hair might stand up. But over the course of those 23 years, my opinions slowly changed. And why those opinions changed, I think, might provide some useful insight about how to better inform this conversation and how, indeed, to better educate and persuade people that climate action is warranted, something that I now believe, though I didn't in the past. So why did I change my mind? I consider myself something of a Republican elite, so maybe this will give you some help. First of all, my opinion changed on the science. I'm not a physicist, I'm not a scientist, but like so many people in American politics today, that doesn't stop me from opining or stopping media outlets from wanting to hear my opinion. And so, like most people in this world, we rely on the scientific experts to better inform what we have to say. So a bit more than a decade ago, I was on television debating a fellow named Joe Rahm, who is presently at Center for American Progress. Some of you may know him. And we were having a debate about the science. And I said, look, the point here is in 1988, I said, James Hansen testified in front of the United States Senate. And he said that if we continue along business as usual from this point forward, we're going to see a tremendous amount of warming, which will impose huge economic and environmental costs. And I said, well, we've had a bit more than a decade since James Hansen provided that testimony, so we can now look back and see what happened. And I said on TV, it turns out that we've only seen about a quarter the amount of warming that James Hansen says we should have seen right now, which doesn't suggest that climate change isn't happening. It just suggests that the atmosphere is not as sensitive to greenhouse gas emissions as the models would have us believe. So I went into the green room with Joe after the segment, and Joe turned to me as we're getting our makeup taken off, and he said, did you even read James Hansen's testimony? And I said, well, a long time ago. This was based on testimony that a colleague of mine gave in front of the United States Senate a few months ago. And he says, I challenge you, go back to your office and reread that testimony. He said, if you do that, here's what you're going to find. You're going to find that what you said, strictly speaking, was more or less correct. But James Hansen gave several other scenarios for future warming. Scenario A was his business as usual scenario. He said, but if you look at that scenario, you'll find that he was off because the emissions he thought we'd see from 1988 to the present were far higher than what we've really seen. So maybe James Hansen isn't the best economic forecaster. But if you look at scenario B's and C, he gave different emissions trajectories with actually different temperature estimates with regards to what kind of warming we'd expect to see from that. He said, if you look at the emissions trajectories we've seen since 1988, they match up pretty well with scenario B. And he said, and there's an emission, and there is a temperature projection there. And if you go back and read it, you'll see it's pretty spot on. He said, so the point isn't that the models run hot, that the environment is not so sensitive to greenhouse gas emissions. It's that the business as usual scenario from Hansen had more emissions than we've actually seen because we had recessions and natural gas penetrate the market and various things. He said, now the problem here, Jerry, says Joe, is that it just took me a few minutes to explain that to you. I don't have a few minutes to explain it on television at that level of detail, which is why I hate debating hacks like you. He says, or don't go back and check. Be a hack. I mean, I'm sure it pays well. Well, I was in the business of actually waging and winning the war of ideas and wrestling with the smartest and the best that would wrestle with me on television or in publications. So I took that up as a challenge. So I went back to my office and I looked at James Hansen's testimony, and it looked to me that Joe Rahm was right. So I walked down the hall to talk to my colleague who had given that testimony in front of the Senate a few months back, who is a climate scientist published in the peer-reviewed literature. He was one of the scientists that I relied upon to inform these discussions I had in public on these matters, and I explained to him what happened. I said, so what am I missing? Because it seems to me that Joe's right. And it turned out I wasn't missing anything, nor was Joe missing anything. And this scientist said, well, did James Hansen give a business as usual scenario with a temperature projection, yes or no? And I said, yeah. And was that off by a great deal? And I said, yeah. And he says, then why are we having this conversation? I said, did you hear what I said? And it turns out he did hear what I said, and eventually it turned into an argument that that James Hansen get his own attorney and his own spokesman on television and let him answer uncomfortable questions. In other words, I came point blank to the fact that the information I was being fed by the scientists I relied upon was intentionally disingenuous and misrepresentative of what this debate was really about. So from that point, I began to do the due diligence I should have done. Now, you might say, well, Jerry, you should be in the business of due diligence. You're not just Chuckles the Clown. You're working at the Cato Institute. You're on television. You're talking about climate. It's a good idea to know what you're talking about, which is certainly true. But the reality is that it is not human nature to examine the arguments that you want to believe anywhere near as vigorously or skeptically as the arguments that you don't believe. And this, again, is a universal fact of human nature. So I began to do that due diligence because, unlike maybe some of my colleagues, I didn't want to look foolish on television, and I didn't want smart people to think I didn't know what I was talking about or that I was consciously misrepresenting the debate. And what I found was that example after example after example, the same thing kept coming to light. Misrepresentations of the debate, or they were cherry-picking data, or the information was really bad, or it turns out that this impressive and seemingly compelling scientific argument couldn't get published in a peer-reviewed journal. There was probably a good reason for that. So I began to lose a lot of faith in the scientific arguments I trafficked in, so much so that I tried to stay away from them as much as I could. But that left me with economic arguments, which is a nice, rich field for a libertarian after all. And it turns out through the 1990s and into the early to mid-2000s, you could find academics in the economics profession who would make a cost-benefit argument against the kind of aggressive decarbonization that's on the agenda today. Because let's face it, taking fossil fuels out of the global economy on a forced march is a really expensive proposition. It's not lightly done. It is a heck of a challenge. This entire global economy and modern industrialized society has been based on fossil fuels, and re-engineering it to renewable energies, which are intermittent, dispersed forms of energy, is not that easy. But over time, what I found is that I could no longer find many economists, and then any economists, to make a cost-benefit argument against climate change, because low-carbon energies continue to decline in cost, innovations continue to make them more and more competitive with fossil fuels, and what we were learning about what climate change would do to the planet became so bracing that the costs of doing something were dwarfed by the benefits of doing something. It literally got to the point in my time at the Cato Institute that I could not find a single economist who published in the peer-reviewed literature on climate change who'd make a cost-benefit argument against some degree of meaningful climate action. That's pretty bracing. I worked in a think tank. My job was to arbitrage between academia and public policy. It was to find these academics and marshal them, and they literally didn't exist. The free market economists that I had been used to citing, who would make those cost-benefit arguments, over the course of time basically flew the white flag and changed their minds. Oh yes, I could find a professor of entrepreneurship at Appalachian State College who got there on a Koch fellowship, who didn't publish in the peer-reviewed literature, had no special knowledge of climate economics or energy economics at all, who might opine for a think tank in a non-peer-reviewed journal against climate action. That's not that hard to do. But finding one who was actually in the fray in a peer-reviewed world, who knew what they were talking about, no, they disappeared. And so I became very reluctant to marshal the economic arguments. But then there were the moral arguments. I mean, let's face it, there was still a lot of residual libertarian in me, and who wants to completely replumb the global economy on a front like this? But then a colleague of mine named Jonathan Adler came along with a paper for Case Western. Now, Jonathan Adler, back in the day, had been my colleague at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and he, like me, was in charge of the climate and energy shop there. And for those of you who don't know Wingnut Land, the Competitive Enterprise Institute is an extremely hard right-of-center libertarian conservative organization that probably is more influential with the EPA and Scott Pruett today than anybody else. Well, John used to run that shop, but then he went on to become a law professor at Case Western. He wrote a really interesting paper around 2007 or 8, something like that, in which he said, look, even if everything that libertarians say about climate change is true, that it will be a low-impact outcome, that it'll be, the climate change will be at the very low end of the IPCC projections, it's not going to have that many economic costs, or that at least the benefits of climate change are enough that the costs of doing something about it are greater than the benefits you gain. He said, even if all these things are true, that's not a good argument against climate action if you're a conservative or libertarian, because after all, conservatives or libertarians believe in property rights. And they don't believe that party A gets to destroy the property held by party B because A gained more than B lost. It's not why libertarians are put on this earth. Libertarians are put on this earth to protect property rights. And if indeed the benefits of fossil fuel consumption and climate change are greater than the cost of doing something about it, at the very least, the people injured by climate change should be compensated. Otherwise, we're in a world in which we're using utilitarian calculations to allow some people to destroy the property of others for gain and profit. And there are legitimate utilitarianists out there who will make that argument, but libertarians and conservatives in the places that I work were not amongst them. I found that was a very compelling argument, and it was an argument that never really dawned on me before. You'd think it should have, but it had not. And so I began to circulate that essay with some of my colleagues in the think tank community on the right, and asked, hey, what do you make of Adler's argument? This turned out to be like going up to the Vatican several centuries ago and asking what they made of Martin Luther. They didn't make very much of him, and decided the whole conversation was too dangerous to get into. And so it turned out that the moral argument against climate action fell apart as well. If you believe in first principles that the right says they believe in, you have to concern yourself with the very serious costs associated with climate change, which even the real climate skeptics, the scientists which I trafficked with, who sometimes were disingenuous, even they would acknowledge would occur. The final thing that moved me was a conversation I had with a guy named Bob Litterman. This was right before I left the Cato Institute and started the Niskanen Center. By this time, I didn't want to talk about climate change at all. I just tried to talk about other things in my issue portfolio. But occasionally, because I was so good at this, I kept getting dragged into it. So anyway, Bob Litterman, who is one of the partners at Goldman Sachs, he was in charge of their risk management operation there, and in fact, he was the first quant on Wall Street. And within academia, the Black-Litterman model is still, one of the top models in risk management in the finance sector. He's kind of a legend. And he's a pretty rich guy because he helped Goldman Sachs manage risk with the sorts of expertise he had. And anyway, he wanted to come talk to me about climate change. Now, Bob's on the board of directors of Resources to the Future. We're a wildlife fund and various other organizations. He's a climate mainstreamer. And it frustrated him that as kind of a soft libertarian, the cathedral for his ideas, the Cato Institute, was thinking so poorly on the issue. And so he came to see me and he said, look, the bottom line here is the debate you're engaged in is poorly framed. He says, your people are arguing with mainstream climate scientists about the most likely outcome from climate change. And you think it'll be at the low end of the IPCC spread of possible outcomes, and your opponents think it'll be at the mid-level or even high level, and this is the hot debate. So that's the wrong way to think about risk. He said, look, I deal with risks like climate change in other contexts in financial markets all the time at Goldman Sachs. And we don't adjudicate how to manage these risks by what the most likely outcome is of a given investment. We look at the full range of the full distribution of possible outcomes from an investment scenario, and we weigh those risks, we price them in our models, and then we make decisions. We don't necessarily default to the worst case scenario, he said, but we have to consider it. And he says, now even your guys, because he said, I know because I've read their stuff, even your scientists acknowledge there's a lot of uncertainty about climate change. There's a lot we don't know, which is true. There is a great deal we don't know that we'd like to know. But we know the important things. And we know what we more or less have a rough idea what the distribution of possible outcomes are. And if you take a full look at them, they range from relatively benign, if everything breaks well, and we don't have low probability, high impact scenarios playing out, and clouds work in a certain way that looks like they won't. But you can tell a story that you're at the low end of the IPCC spread with modest climate impacts and no tipping points. So, but you can also see pretty much Jurassic Park, burning hothouse Earth on a much faster march than you might think. In other words, you could see apocalyptic scenarios in that distribution, and then everything in between. It says, now, if you price the risks associated with that full range of possible outcomes, it is insane not to hedge, especially since these are non-diversifiable risks. He said, then if climate change plays out in a disastrous fashion, there's nothing we can invest in that's going to pay off to hedge against, the damages we took on climate change. Now, in financial markets, almost every bad event we can hedge because there will be offsetting investments that will pay off if these bad events occur. So we can diversify our risk portfolio a bit. Can't do that in climate change. Nothing pays out. He says, so libertarians are fond of saying, when we're dealing with public commons and public goods issues, what we want to think about is how would private actors and markets deal with these problems if that was their decision to make? He says, well, we know how private actors in financial markets deal with non-diversifiable risk, because non-diversifiable risks do exist. So they avoid them like the plague. They pay massive amounts of money to avoid those kind of risks. If we did the same thing in climate, then the issue is clear. We have to hedge. We have to act. Well, so Bob left my office, and I turned to my colleague who was in the meeting with me, and I said, unless I'm missing something, there's nothing but smoking rubble left of our arguments. And he said, yeah. Turns out there wasn't a whole lot of room for non-denialist ideas at the Cato Institute, so for that and other reasons, I left to start my own think tank. But to wrap up and move on to the conversation and questions, the point here is that while I don't mean to say that my experience is necessarily a blueprint that can be used on every single climate skeptic or denialist or agnostic voter or pundit that you might encounter, but the fact is that when you're dealing with elites, evidence does count. The idea that you shouldn't debate science with them, I mean, there's a lot of work on that, but then there's a lot of work at the George Mason University Center for Climate Communications by John Cook there and Ed Maybach that finds, no, actually very few people quite realize how strong the scientific evidence is on climate change, even in the Democratic vote. So the idea that science should be avoided, I'm not entirely sure I buy. The idea that you can't engage in a moral conversation, I think is wrong. It's one of the most decisive things that move me. But of course, messenger counts as much as message here. That argument out of, say, the head of Greenpeace is not going to be as compelling as that argument from my friend who used to run the climate shop at CEI, who's a dyed-in-the-wool libertarian. It obviously gets your attention a lot greater in that fashion. So those are some few hints. Unfortunately, I can't really repair to the academic literature about what moves policy elites and political elites because it has been relatively understudied. So we're in a world of learning by doing, but I think that gives you some idea in some ways to move forward in a more sensible fashion. Anyway, thank you for your time, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jerry. And I love to listen to that whole story. So, thank you. Let me now bring up Karen Florini of Climate Central. She will talk about some of the tools and materials that Climate Central has created for those of us in the policy sector to educate people about the need to implement a range of policies. Thank you much for being here, Karen.
Thank you. Somewhere in my youth or childhood, I must have done something terrible to be fated to be the last speaker late on a Friday afternoon on the last panel following Jerry Taylor. And in particular, if I could get my slides up, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you, there we go. Can that go to full screen? Thanks. I'm gonna do a handful of 5 tips or 5 tools and 3 tips. And I'm gonna do these really, really fast because after sitting in this auditorium all day, you don't wanna hear a lot more people blathering at you. Just one quick word to mention that we are a non-advocacy climate research and communications NGO. Bob Litterman is also on our board. We're based here in Princeton. So again, 5 tools, 3 tips. Tool number 1. For each of the 244 media markets in the US, we are now producing on a weekly basis broadcast quality visuals showing climate weather linkages. We do this for our network of roughly 500 meteorologists around the United States. So, and they are now available to you as well. I'll get to that in a moment. So we've got days above 95. Noted that this is Providence, the one that I just was talking about, New York City. So again, localized information. Baltimore, mosquito season. We also do explainers that show how small changes in averages have huge changes in extremes, and it's the extremes that matter here. We've also started covering more and more on solutions, falling residential solar costs. We've heard a lot today. One thing we haven't heard as much about is the fact that agriculture can help with this. Again, these are intended to be graphic, literally graphic representations. Whoops, sorry. That one was New Jersey. Earlier this afternoon, it was mentioned about, someone raised a question about what do you do with different emissions from cars. Depending on where you live, the answer is different. One of our interactives from a year or so ago gets into the question, sorry, I'm having trouble with this little thing, depending on where you live. All this information is now available to you through our media library, which allows you to pick a media market, again, 244 across the United States, as well as keyword and topic. Tool number 2, localized sea level rise visuals in the here in the Northeast. If I give this talk in the Midwest, I can't use these. But here in the Northeast, there are obviously sea level rise is a huge issue. If you put sea level rise in on the search field, then you can get a sense of the places within New Jersey, whether it's city wards or municipalities, coastal areas, et cetera. That will let you get specific maps. This, of course, now no longer being New Jersey. You can get flyover visuals that help show in sort of 3D what it would look like with significant amounts of sea level rise. You can take iconic images. There aren't very many of these yet, but we're adding more. Look what happens with sea level rise and Wall Street. You can also get into more nerdy kinds of information that can nonetheless be useful in some contexts. With the users can set the amount of sea level rise, whether it's down to 1 or up to 10 feet, get you some information on specific populations at risk, at infrastructure, contaminated areas, and land values, among a whole bunch of other things as well. We also have sliders. I can't do it, it won't work on this is a static image, but on the website, you can slide this across to see what it looks like now and what it looks like with substantial levels of sea level rise. This, of course, being Mar-a-Lago. This, for some reason, is our most popular slider. Fabulous photos. So that was a very quick overview of some of the materials that Climate Central itself generates. I want to mention a couple of things from other sources as well. Climate visuals, amazing photographs. Some of these are not free. Everything that's on our site is free. These vary. Just wanted to highlight that. It's a new site. I think it's very impressive. Oftentimes, what really is being discussed nowadays is what are the economic impacts of climate change, and the Climate Impact Lab has some good information on that will be coming out this summer. At the moment, they've only got temperatures on their nice county-by-county map, but this summer they're going to start having a number of others as well, including on mortality, agricultural yields, labor, property crime, and violent crime. So look for that this summer. Tool number 5, the last one, localized solutions info. And this is, I think, something that you might find particularly useful. Again, you can go pick a particular state, and you can find information on jobs, solar and wind jobs, investments, and projects. And this maps it in considerable detail. When you hover over a particular one, you can get census tract level information. And this comes up for legislative districts, counties, et cetera. So very comprehensive. That's a project of Clean Energy Progress, which is, among others, Ingersoll Rand and Environmental Defense Fund, so an interesting pairing there. Postscript on this, New York State has put together a very large, robust database with all kinds of stuff in it. The U.S. Climate Alliance, which is I think it's 16 states now, is actively seeking funding to be able to compile similarly comprehensive libraries of state-specific data for other states as well. All right, and then very quickly, my trio of tips. Keep it simple and straightforward. I think one of the problems that we end up with in climate communication, and here I'm talking less about elites than I am to speaking with your constituents, is we let ourselves get bogged down in a lot of details. I think there are basically 5 points. We know we can go in the lab and measure that CO2 traps heat. We know, without a doubt, that burning fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide. We know from studies of geologic history that a few degrees matter a lot. The last time it was about 7 degrees hotter, we had a sheet of ice a mile thick over Manhattan. We know that risks are big in terms of impacts potentially on global food and water supplies, mass displacements, and so forth. And we know that solutions are already abundant and increasingly cheap. But here's the thing that I think is often missed. It takes time to deploy these at scale. 85% of the world's primary productivity is still coming out of fossil fuels. We're not going to turn that around overnight. The only way to avoid potential catastrophe, if it turns out, as Jerry was saying, that the risks are or the impacts occur at the high end, is if we act now. Because if we wait until we're seeing those impacts, it will be impossible to do anything serious about them. One argument that we often hear is, oh, it's natural cycles. Here's my favorite response to that. Just as most people die of natural causes, it doesn't mean that murder doesn't occur. So the fact that we had a number of major shifts in the global climate before humans were engaged in putting lots of heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere doesn't mean that we're not the ones who are responsible for it now. Tip number 2, Jerry alluded to this, the scientific consensus And the folks at George Mason University have this very nice handbook called the Consensus Handbook that goes through a lot of the particulars about how few people understand this, even on the pro-climate action side of things. It's 97%. You can quibble with whether it's 93 or 90 or 97, but it's a very, very, very overwhelming majority. Conveying that fact actually is one of the things that turns out to be very important in moving people who are confused about the issue. Finally, I want to mention that if you want more information on how to talk to a climate skeptic, according to Google, in 0.36 seconds, you can get nearly 500,000 hits. So there's a lot of other information out there. Very briefly, I'll just mention that also at George Mason University, there's a lot of survey data that you may wish to poke into if you need to get some specifics. One place where I would disagree with Jerry is there is now starting to be some academic literature on analyzing how to talk more specifically on climate skepticism. This is a particular article written by one of my colleagues at Climate Central that goes into some particulars if someone really wants to delve into this. Tip number 3 says who. One of the things that I find useful is to acknowledge at this point that even Exxon is agreeing that the risk of climate change is clear and warrants action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much, Karen. I'm going to make you feel really good because you're not the last speaker.
Ah.
No, seriously, thank you very much, and I want to thank Jerry as well, and Lonnie. I just wanted to conclude with a couple of quick remarks and then open it up for questions. Back in 2007, in Massachusetts, we decided to go across the state and talk about climate change. And we also decided to pass a Global Warming Solutions Act, which mandated in state statute to lower greenhouse gas emissions 25% below the 1990 levels by 2020 and 80% below by 2050. And I must tell you that in my own district and across the state, I almost had my head handed to me because I didn't have any reference points to point to, just general data. And of course, Jerry was out there on the other side. So I was in big trouble. But believe it or not, we actually managed somehow to get the votes together because we had a new governor that came into office from the executive branch. And being in the executive branch, you can use the bully pulpit and cut through a lot of the red tape of where the average rep or senator is trying to communicate. And the governor could have statewide jurisdiction in terms of cutting into those airways any afternoon or morning he chose to do so. So we had a Speaker of the House that was on board, a Senate President that was on board. I was leading the effort in the Senate, and we passed the 2008 Global Warming Solutions Act. Now we fast forward. Here we are, 10 years later. 10 years later, and you all, in all your states, you have this. You have positive data, significant evidence that you can point to relative to the positive aspects of where you are relative to solar, to jobs created, et cetera. In Massachusetts today, we created a $14.5 billion green energy economy as a result of adopting that legislation. 6,700 companies have been created in the green economy, 109,000 private sector jobs. Greenhouse gas emissions are on track to meet our 25% below the 1990 level that we promised that we wanted to do. So we didn't lose jobs as predicted, we gained them. And at the same time we were increasing economic activity and increasing private sector jobs, we were lowering our greenhouse gas emissions. And by the way, a new governor was elected, a Republican. And that Republican governor, as a result of the evidence that was very clear, actually signed on to the Paris Agreement, signed on to the 2030 standards with the premiers and governors in New England, and is supporting the implementation of the Global Warming Solutions Act implementation in Massachusetts. And we have bipartisan support in the Senate and in the House, the minority leader in the House and the Senate. So now we're able to really change the narrative, as Lonnie said at the beginning. And what Karen is doing with Climate Central, I can tell you there's about a dozen things you just mentioned that I'm going to be using right away. Because it's great when we have that information to be able to articulate to our constituents and the local press, especially if it's set up in a format where we can use it on social media, we can get it out right away, we have visuals that are talking to these issues, and we have evidence about what we're talking about. And so with that, I'm going to conclude speaking from the panel and open it up for a couple of questions before we end the session today.
We have
Any
a Twitter
questions?
feed. Anybody wants to join, we've got a Twitter feed.
Twitter feed, all right. Anybody want to tweet anything out? Yes.
I'll ask a question, I guess, for any one of all four of you, which is, which of the solutions do you need to be talking about with some care? And we have this sense that if we can go down the renewables route, it's relatively safe, it might get us where we want to go. But there are other people, other scientists, who will be coming up with other solutions which might be faster. I'm thinking specifically of geoengineering, which I think has some traction in some of the groups you're trying to reach. Others would put nuclear power in that category. When do you have to discriminate among solutions? When do you get into that argument?
Well, if I could just say something quickly and then turn it over to the panelists. I think it's very important as legislators that we do not make the perfect the enemy of the good. There's a lot of great ideas out there, and I hear great ideas all the time, in particular from academics, talking about what we should do, what we shouldn't do, et cetera. And we need to have that information. That's why it was so important to do this conference here at Princeton, because it educates all of us to be better prepared to, put forth the policy. Quite frankly, to reach the numbers that we want to meet in Massachusetts, which was the standard that I heard in a workshop that the feds were trying to do, and the 80% by 2050, we're going to need all of those solutions implemented to reach those requirements in Massachusetts. So we want to do as much as possible with offshore wind, renewables. We haven't even scratched the surface on energy efficiency. And Massachusetts is #1 in the US in energy efficiency. We're very proud of that, but when we really are honest about it, it doesn't take a lot of work to be #1, given what everybody is not doing on energy efficiency. So we have it within our own power to make these differences. We're putting forth bold legislation right now in our state to go up to 5 gigawatts of offshore wind, to increase storage to 2,000 megawatts of storage capacity, to increase the PACE program, residential, not only commercial, for solar, eliminate net metering caps, so on and so forth. So we're trying to be bold and put that out there so that we can negotiate with the other branches of government to get something done again this session. In a legislative session, sometimes you get something done in a session, and okay, we're not going to take that up again for 2-3 more sessions. That we've done energy policy, or we've done environmental policy. Last session, when we passed 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind. Well, since then, you've seen political change in New Jersey, a lot more aggressiveness in New York, a lot more happening in Connecticut, in Maryland, et cetera. So that, believe it or not, we were #1 in all the renewables, besides California. You know, after California, Massachusetts led the way in renewables. You know, 6 months later, we were 4th in terms of what was happening with public policy. That's good news. So that gives us the incentive to still wanting to be #1. So anyway.
I'm going to say, in terms of dealing in the Connecticut legislature, when I was made chair of the Energy and Technology Committee, it was a very divided committee. And I brought, because I believe you need to form collaborations around major issues. And instead of people going to the corners, I wanted to make them stakeholders in the end product. So I brought everybody into the process from jump, from both sides of the aisle. And it was raucous. I remember reading the Robert Caro books about LBJ. And one of the things that I remember very strongly was apparently LBJ had an enemy come into the Oval Office, and one of the staffers said, you know, Mr. President, he's never been a supporter of yours. And LBJ said, and I'll clean it up, but LBJ said, I'd rather have him in the tent whizzing out than outside the tent whizzing in. So I want people around the table from the beginning, not just the legislators, but their top staff and policy people, and you begin to hear where the blowback's coming from. You know, you can begin to see, and this cost shift thing is huge. You know, this concern about who's experiencing the benefits of renewables and who's paying for it, and I mean, that is a huge issue. But we've really been able to make enormous progress, you know, bringing people on board, making them stakeholders in the final product, making them realize that, and listening to them, you know, so we do compromise. The enemy of the rational, I call it. You know, because, you know, you have extremes on both sides, and to come up with something that's going to move us forward and that everybody feels proud of and that everybody can run on. That's the other thing, you know, to have achievements that people can run on. That's huge. And we've really been able to do that in Connecticut, and I'm very proud of it. We just got this bill out the other night, which is also moving us forward. And as I said, it was raucous. But boy, I took it out, and my ranking Republican on the other side, the two of us were like a team and pitching back and forth. And boy, it was great. At the final vote, I think, what was it? It was 2/3. We got 2/3, and at some point it was in doubt, but we just went in there, dug in there, brought everybody, you know, to the party, and fought it together. Before, when I first came to the legislature and I was on the committee, the House chair and the Senate chair, because we have the bicameral committees, didn't even talk to each other. They fought. It was like, I thought we were going to have to get a marriage counselor. So you couldn't even have the House chair and the Senate chair working together, let alone the Democrats and the Republicans. And we would have bills blow up in the middle of the night, aircraft carrier bills blow up in the middle of the night, and never get through. And now, and I kept thinking, well, why would we ram such important policy down people's throats with just a couple of votes? You know, why can't we bring people together and team up and find something that we can all feel proud of? And so we've been able to do that. I mean, it's not easy, but I think it's really, really important.
Thank you. Jerry, Karen, any
Well,
closing comments?
there's enough libertarian DNA in me left to make an observation about the engineering versus economic solutions to this problem. The fact is that for a lot of people in my old world, the idea of centrally planning the energy system over the course of the next century is one that makes their blood run cold. The reality is that this is beyond the ken of mortal man. Not because of corruption, not because of political dynamics, not because of ill will, but because experts honestly disagree. Some believe that electric vehicles are the future for the transportation sector, but a vocal and intelligent minority believe that no, fuel cells ultimately offer the best hope for a decarbonized transportation system. And then other people I know say, no, really liquid biofuels, particularly the really advanced stuff, makes more economic sense. Now, I have my opinions about who has the stronger argument at present, but every single one of these perspectives has very smart people behind them who can't be so casually dismissed. And I will wager, no insult to legislators in this room, that none of you are really well equipped to adjudicate that debate. And this goes on across the board in the energy sector. How much nuclear are we going to need in the future? Marc Jacobson, a rather prominent academic, says none. But then there are a lot of academics who say you're nuts and that there has to be some degree of nuclear here. Otherwise, we're going to have ridiculously expensive backstop power, and this makes sense. And we can go on and on and on with this conversation. The real value of a carbon price, whether derived through a carbon tax or a cap and trade regime, is that it allows us to just say, I'm neutral on this. I don't know. I do know that if we have a robust price on greenhouse gas emissions and we leave it to market actors to sort out, then they will choose the most economic means of getting there because there's economic merit in those decisions. Now, I don't believe that carbon pricing is all that is required in our portfolio of policy responses for various different reasons we don't need to get into. So there is space for, say, green bonds program. Maybe there's a space for RPSs, though they are kind of expensive. But when we do that, we need to be more agnostic. Most states with their renewable portfolio standards have carve-outs. You know, they're not including hydro or nuclear, which is low carbon. That makes no sense. Or they require a certain amount of solar energy to be part of the mix. But why is that? Why are we going to advantage solar relative to wind? These are political calculations. Now, I know that politics is the art of the possible, not exhortation for the impossible. So all policy design is going to be politicized to some extent, and it has to be. So I don't mean to be Jeremiah in the wilderness. But all I do mean to say is to the extent to which you possibly can, it would be best to express a bit of humility about an incredibly difficult task and have some faith that profit incentives will probably drive market actors to make the right decisions that we want society to make.
Thank you, Jerry.
I'll just say one other quick thing, getting back to Rob's mention of geoengineering, which is something really that hasn't been talked about here at all today. A scientist I know who was working on it pointed out that really there's two fundamental questions. Can you guarantee that we'll do it in perpetuity? And what happens if we suddenly stop? Because then you've got a situation where carbon emissions you've continued to have accumulation of carbon levels in the atmosphere, and suddenly you're not doing geoengineering, which in many circumstances would involve putting up little tiny particles of sulfur or of the compounds up into the upper atmosphere to deflect radiation from ever reaching the Earth's surface. What happens if you stop and you have very high concentrations of greenhouse gases? You'd potentially be looking at very, very rapid warming with potentially catastrophic consequences. So I think those are the fundamental questions that have to be answered about geoengineering.
And one final thing I wanted to say is that actually, I'm surprised none of us had brought it up before, but it's something that when I look back at my experience in Massachusetts, that in particular now, what we're talking about, public health. In communicating these issues, public health is critical. Air quality is critical. Asthma rates. All of those organizations that stem around the public health care community in Massachusetts, we have a group called Healthcare Without Harm, and they're very active on this question. The American Lung Association has become engaged with this question. So in communicating this issue, that is one thing that is extremely important.
Can I, as a follow-up on that, one thing I should have included in my helpful tips, there's a group called Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health.
Right.
It's 25, I think, or so different medical professional associations that are joined together to be working on climate. They have a number of resources, including a database of health professionals from all over the country who are willing to engage, to help work toward low carbon policies and solutions. So that's a resource that I absolutely should have listed on my little tools kit.
So listen, as we conclude this panel, and before I bring up Rona to end this, let me just thank Reed for allowing us to come into New Jersey and to Princeton. And also, I also want to thank the ERC, the staff here in CSG, and also Wendell Hannaford, who is here and has been here through the whole day, and personally being involved in this and supporting this. And I want to thank the ERC CSG office for committing to continue to have this dialogue, because I think it's so important for us to continue to educate ourselves regionally. And then for the final word, I want to bring out I have my star, person that's working with us and has just done a fantastic job in terms of energy and environmental policy, Rona Cohen. So I want to thank